Nobody in the valley of Coldwater Bend could say exactly when Violet Harrington stopped smiling. Some of the older women at the general store claimed she had been a bright child once. Curious eyes, quick laugh. The kind of girl who collected wildflowers and pressed them between the pages of her mother's old books. But that was before she understood what went on inside her parents' house after supper. Before she learned that two people could share a roof, a table, and a last name, and still be completely alone. By the time Violet was 26, she had built her life around one quiet conviction: that love was not something real women counted on. It was a story told to young girls to keep them hopeful and compliant. She ran her small homestead on the eastern edge of town with discipline and precision. She planted her own garden, mended her own fences, kept her own accounts. She was not unhappy, she told herself. She was simply practical. What she never told anyone was that some nights the silence inside her cabin pressed against her chest like a stone. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Thursday in late October, with almost no warning. Violet had seen the sky turn that particular shade of greenish-gray before. Her father used to call it a liar's sky, pretty until it wasn't. She had already brought the chickens in and latched the barn door when the wind shifted hard from the north and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a single breath. She made it back to the cabin just as the first wall of rain hit the valley like a curtain being torn down. She lit the lamp, put water on the stove, and told herself she was fine. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee when she heard something hit the porch steps. Not the wind, not a branch, something heavier, something that groaned. Violet stood very still for a moment, the cup warm in both hands. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was also not foolish. She set the cup down, took the small rifle from its place beside the door, and opened it exactly 3 inches. The man on her porch steps was face down in the mud. He was large, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a heavy canvas coat that was soaked clean through. One hand was stretched out ahead of him, as though he had been reaching for the door when his legs gave out. A gash across his left temple had mixed with rainwater and spread down the side of his face in a thin indewing. Violet stood in the doorway for a long moment, a rain blowing sideways across the porch. She was not responsible for this man. She did not know him. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to close the door, wait out the storm, and send for the sheriff, come morning. She leaned the rifle against the wall and stepped outside. Getting him through the door was not graceful work. He was conscious enough to push weakly with his boots, but not conscious enough to be useful about it. By the time she had him on the floor near the stove, her back ached, and her dress was soaked to the knee. She cut his coat off with her sewing scissors, because there was no other practical way, checked that the gash on his head was deep but not dangerous, and wrapped it with the cleanest cloth she had. He had no horse, no pack that she could find. Only a battered leather satchel that had somehow stayed looped across his chest through whatever had happened to him out there in the dark. She did not open it. She put a blanket over him, moved her chair to the far side of the room, and watched him breathe until the storm quieted sometime after midnight. Then she fell asleep, sitting upright with her hands folded in her lap, which was, she thought distantly before her eyes closed, exactly the kind of thing a practical woman would do. He woke the following morning while she was outside feeding the chickens. By the time she came back in, he was sitting up against the wall beside the stove with the blanket across his lap and both hands wrapped around the cup of coffee she had left on the floor near him, not because she had intended it for him, but because she had simply set it down and forgotten it. His eyes were dark and very steady. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by altitude rather than age. Not old, not young, somewhere in between, with the particular stillness of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and alone. He looked at her when she came through the door and said, "Thank you for pulling me in." His voice was quiet, not rough exactly, but used sparingly, the way some men use good tools, only when the job requires it. Violet hung her coat on the hook by the door and said, "Can you walk?" He considered this seriously, as though it were a reasonable question deserving a reasonable answer. "Not far," he said. "Not yet." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the stove and put more water on. "You'll stay until the mud dries," she said, with her back to him. "After that, you're on your own." He said nothing. But when she glanced back over her shoulder, there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite gratitude, something quieter than both, and somehow more unsettling. She turned back to the stove and told herself it meant nothing. His name was Elias. He offered it that afternoon without being asked, in the middle of a silence that had stretched long enough that most people would have filled it with something meaningless. He didn't. He simply said, "Elias," as though continuing a conversation they had already been having. "Violet," she said, without looking up from her mending. He nodded once, as if that settled something, and went back to looking at the fire. She told herself he was just a stranger she had pulled out of the mud, but a man with nowhere to be in a storm. The moment the ground firmed up, he would be gone, back to wherever a man like that came from. The mountains, probably, given the way he sat with his back straight and his hands still, completely unbothered by silence and space. That was fine. That was exactly fine. What she did not expect was that on the second morning, she would wake before dawn and lie in the dark listening to the quiet sounds of him on the other side of the wall, the small shift of the floorboards, the careful sound of him feeding wood into the stove so she wouldn't wake to a cold house, and feel, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, that the silence inside the cabin was not pressing against her chest at all. She lay there a long moment staring at the ceiling. Then she got up, tied her hair back, and went to make breakfast because she was a practical woman, and that was what practical women did. But the feeling did not leave. The mud dried on the fourth day. Violet knew it before she even stepped outside. She could tell by the way the morning light came through the window. Sharper, cleaner, the kind of light that only arrives after the land has had its fill of water and settled back into itself. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the yard and thought, well, that's that then. She expected to feel relieved. She did not feel relieved. Elias was already up when she came downstairs, which had become his habit, quiet and unhurried, moving around her kitchen with the careful consideration of a man who understood he was a guest in someone else's space. Yet he had repaired the loose hinge on her back door the previous afternoon without being asked, using tools he'd found in her barn, and returning them exactly where he'd found them. He had not made a point of it, had not waited for her to notice. She had noticed anyway. She set her cup down and said, "Ground's firm." He looked up from the stove. "It is," he agreed. There was a pause that lasted several seconds longer than it should have. "You'll be wanting to move on then," she said. Elias looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "I don't have anywhere pressing to be." Violet picked her cup back up. "Everyone has somewhere to be." "Not me," he said simply, and turned back to the stove. "Not right now." She wanted to tell him that was not a reasonable answer, that she had not agreed to anything beyond the mud drying, that this was her home and her space, and she had managed perfectly well alone for years, and did not require the company of a man she had found unconscious on her porch steps 4 days ago. She said none of those things. What she said was, There's a fence post on the north side that needs resetting. Elias nodded once. I'll find it. The days that followed had a shape to them that Violet did not entirely trust. It was too easy, was the problem. Elias moved through her homestead, the way weather moves through a valley, present and real, but never demanding anything of the landscape it passed through. He worked from early morning until the light failed, taking on the kind of slow, persistent tasks that had accumulated across 3 years of her managing. Everything alone. Fence posts, a sagging barn beam, or the root cellar door that had swollen in the wet and refused to close properly. He never asked what needed doing. He simply looked, assessed, and did the work. And in the evenings, he sat by the fire with whatever he was reading, a worn book he kept in that leather satchel she still had not asked about, and said little. Sometimes nothing at all, for hours. But it was not the silence of her childhood home. Not cold, not loaded, not a silence that meant something had gone wrong between two people. It was simply the silence of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. And that, Violet found, was an entirely different thing. She began to dread the evenings less. That frightened her more than anything else. On the 7th night, she asked him about the mountains. She hadn't planned to. They were eating supper. She had made a simple stew, nothing elaborate, the same thing she made when she was cooking for one. And the question came out of her before she had fully decided to ask it. How long have you been up there? Elias didn't ask what she meant. 6 years, he said. Alone? Mostly. She watched him for a moment. And you don't find that... She paused, searching for the right word. Lonely? He offered quietly. I was going to say difficult. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. It was what I needed at the time, he said. Quiet has a way of sorting things out that noise never quite manages. Violet turned this over in her mind. What needed sorting? He looked at her steadily across the table. A version of myself I wasn't particularly proud of, he said. Nothing dramatic. Just choices I'd made that weren't in line with who I wanted to be. She had expected something larger, some dark history, some wound he was running from. The plainness of his answer surprised her more than a dramatic confession would have. Did it work? She asked. Mostly, he said, in exactly the same tone he had used to answer the question about being alone, as though he had made peace with the mostly and did not need it to be more than that. Violet looked down at her bowl. Something about the simplicity of his honesty made her chest feel strange, a little tight, a little open at the same time, like a window that hadn't been used in years being eased off its latch. She did not examine the feeling. She cleared the bowls and went to bed. Yet the trouble began, if trouble was even the right word for something so quiet, on a Wednesday morning when Ruth Calloway came by. Ruth was the nearest neighbor, a sharp-eyed woman of 50, who had opinions about everything and the confidence to share them freely. She came with a jar of preserved peaches and a look on her face when she spotted Elias repairing the stone wall near the garden that Violet recognized immediately and liked not at all. Inside, over coffee, Ruth leaned across the table and said in a low voice that somehow managed to carry, "How long has he been here?" 8 days, Violet said. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "He's working," Violet said. "In exchange for room and board. No, it's a practical arrangement." Ruth looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been married 30 years and finds the word practical extremely amusing in certain contexts. "He's handsome," she said. "I hadn't noticed," Violet said. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Violet Ann Harrington," she said. "You notice everything." After Ruth left, Violet stood at the window for a long moment watching Elias work. He had his coat off despite the cold, moving methodically along the wall, fitting each stone with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything. He paused once, looked up at the sky, then back down at the stone in his hand. Completely at ease. Completely present. She turned away from the window. Ruth was wrong. It was a practical arrangement. That was all. Well, what unraveled that particular certainty was not a dramatic moment. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray and still, when Violet came in from the garden to find Elias sitting at her kitchen table with her mother's old pressed flower book open in front of him. He had not been snooping. The book had slipped from the shelf when he'd reached past it for something, and he'd caught it before it hit the floor and opened it without thinking the way anyone would. He looked up when she came in, with genuine apology already forming on his face. But Violet had stopped in the doorway, because he was holding it carefully. Both hands. The way you hold something that belongs to someone else and matters, even if you don't know why it matters. The pages were old and fragile, and the flowers pressed inside were nearly 30 years gone from any garden. But he held it like it was worth being careful with. "I'm sorry," he said. "It fell." She crossed the room, and he held it out to her. She took it, and for a moment their hands were both on it at the same time. His letting go slowly, hers taking hold, and neither of them moved for just a second too long. "My mother's," she said. "I thought it might be," he said quietly. "The handwriting in the margins looked older than you." She looked down at the book. Her mother had written the names of every flower in small, careful script beside each pressed petal. Violet had looked at those words 1,000 times, had spent years feeling the complicated ache of them, the evidence of a woman who had loved small, beautiful things and married a man who couldn't see them. She had a good eye for beauty, Elias said. Even if nobody told her so. Violet looked up at him sharply. She hadn't told him anything about her mother, nothing beyond the fact of her being gone. He hadn't been guessing. He had been reading the margins, the care in those small written words, the flowers chosen, the way someone documents what they love when they believe nobody else will think it worth documenting. Violet set the book down on the table. Her hands were not entirely steady. "I'll start supper," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Elias said nothing. He simply moved to give her space, settling back into his chair by the fire, opening his own book, leaving her to the stove, and the silence, and the strange, full feeling that had taken up residence in her chest and showed absolutely no intention of leaving. That night, long after the fire had burned to coals and the cabin had gone dark and quiet, Violet lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about her parents. She thought about her father's face at the dinner table, present in body, absent in every way that counted. She thought about her mother pressing flowers into books because there was nowhere else to put the tenderness she carried. She thought about the promise she had made herself at 16, standing in the yard on a cold morning, watching her parents move around each other like furniture. "I will never depend on anyone for my happiness. I will never hand someone that kind of power over me." It had felt like wisdom then. Lying in the dark now, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin settling around her, but she found herself wondering for the first time whether the promise had been wisdom at all, or whether it had simply been fear wearing wisdom's clothes. She did not answer the question, but she did not push it away either. And that, for Violet Harrington, was something entirely new. November came in cold and certain, the way it always did in Coldwater Bend. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the season had simply made up its mind overnight. Violet woke to frost on the inside of the window glass and lay there a moment looking at the pale fern patterns it made against the gray morning light, thinking about nothing in particular, which was itself unusual. She was a woman who woke with her mind already organized, already listing, already moving toward the day's work. But the fact that she could lie still for even a few minutes without her thoughts arranging themselves into tasks felt like a small change she couldn't quite account for. She could hear Elias below. The stove, the quiet knock of the kettle being moved, the small domestic sounds that had, without her fully consenting to it, become part of the rhythm of her mornings. She got up, tied her hair back, and went downstairs. He had made coffee and left a cup at her place at the table, which he had begun doing sometime in the second week without comment or ceremony. She sat down and wrapped both hands around it and looked across the table at him and said, "How's the shoulder?" He had strained it 3 days ago, lifting a beam in the barn. He had not complained. She had noticed the way he held it slightly forward when he thought she wasn't watching. Better," he said. "You should rest it today." He looked at her over his cup. "There's the roof section above the—" "It'll keep," she said. "One day won't bring it down." A pause. Then, quietly, "All right." She looked up. In all the weeks he had been here, she had offered him very little in the way of direct care. Practical help, yes, food and shelter, and the occasional dry observation about his stubbornness. But not this, not the simple act of telling him to rest and meaning it as something more than instruction. He was looking at her with that steady expression she had come to know, the one that gave nothing away, but withheld nothing either. Completely open, completely calm. She looked back down at her coffee. "There's bread from yesterday," she said, "and I'll make eggs." "Thank you, Violet," he said. Just that. Her name, and 2 words that in his mouth managed to carry the full weight of everything she hadn't said and he hadn't asked for. She got up and went to the stove. Before her face could do anything, she'd have to explain. Ruth Calloway came again that Friday, this time without the pretense of preserved peaches. She sat down at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and looked at Violet with the direct expression of a woman who had decided a conversation was going to happen, whether the other party was ready or not. "People are talking," she said. "People always are," Violet said. "About you. And him." Violet set her cup down. "There is nothing to talk about." Ruth tilted her head slightly. "Violet, I have known you since you were 9 years old. And I watched you grow up in that house with your parents, and I watched what it did to you. And I have never once in all those years seen you look the way you look when that man comes through a door." The silence that followed was very long. "I don't know what you mean," Violet said, though the words felt thin even as she said them. "Yes, you do," Ruth said, not unkindly. "That's exactly what worries me. Not that you feel it, but that you'll talk yourself out of it before you let yourself have it." After Ruth left, Violet stood in the yard in the cold for a long time, arms folded against the wind, looking at nothing in particular. From the barn, she could hear the faint sounds of Elias doing something quietly useful, despite being told to rest. Not the roof, she noted. Something smaller. Something that wouldn't strain his shoulder. And he had listened to her. He had simply found another way to be useful, because that was who he was. She stood there until her fingers went numb. Then she went inside. That evening, she found him on the porch after supper, sitting on the step looking out at the dark valley with his elbows on his knees and his coffee going cold beside him. She stood in the doorway a moment before he heard her, and in that unguarded moment she saw something in his posture she hadn't seen before. Not sadness exactly, but the particular weight of a man who had been alone long enough that he had almost stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a sound that never changes. She came and sat beside him on the step. Not close, not far, just beside him. They sat without speaking for several minutes. Tituri tutui. Looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the sky, and Violet thought about all the silences she had sat inside across her life, the cold silence of her parents' house, the hollow silence of her early years alone, the pressed stone silence of nights when she would lie awake wondering if this was simply what life was. This silence was none of those things. "Elias," she said. What made you come down from the mountain this time?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "I woke up one morning," he said, "and the quiet felt different. Not peaceful anymore, just empty." He paused. There's a difference. She knew exactly what he meant. She had spent years mistaking one for the other. "I'm not good at this," she said, before she had entirely decided to say it. He turned to look at her. At what?" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "Allowing things." Elias looked at her for a moment with that open, unhurried expression. Then he said, "You pulled a stranger out of the mud in a storm and fed him for 3 weeks, Violet. You're better at it than you think." She looked at him. Something shifted in her chest. Not breaking, not opening exactly. More like a thing that had been held at a careful angle for a very long time, finally being set down flat. "I watched my parents," she said quietly, "for 20 years. 2 people who shared everything and felt nothing for each other. And I decided, very young and very firmly, that love was something that hollowed people out." Elias said nothing. He did not rush to reassure her, did not offer easy contradiction. He simply listened, the way he did everything, completely, without reservation. "I still don't entirely trust it," she said honestly. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "That doesn't bother you?" "No," he said simply. "Trust isn't something I'd want you to give me before you were ready. It wouldn't mean anything if you did." The wind moved through the yard below them, lifting the dry grass in a slow wave. Somewhere in the dark, a nightbird called once and went quiet. Violet looked out at the mountains, his mountains, the place he had come from, the place he had left when the quiet became empty, and felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly, not relief. Something steadier and less dramatic than either. Something that felt, she thought distantly, like the very beginning of trust. "You could stay," she said, "through winter, if you wanted." A pause. "I'd like that," Elias said quietly. Not eagerly, not with relief. Just honestly, calmly, the way he said everything. She nodded once, looking straight ahead. "All right then." They sat on the step until the cold made it impractical, which took longer than it should have, because neither of them was in any particular hurry to go inside. Winter passed the way good things do, slowly, without fanfare, each day small and complete in itself. Elias stayed. He fixed the roof section above the east window and rebuilt the stone wall along the garden's north edge and split enough wood to last well past spring. Violet cooked and kept accounts and mended and planted the cold season herbs she'd been meaning to plant for 2 years and somehow never had. They moved around each other in the small space of the cabin with the natural ease of 2 people who have quietly negotiated a shared life without ever sitting down to do it formally. There were difficult days. Violet had mornings where the old fear returned without warning, where she would look at him across the table and feel the familiar pull to draw back, to remind herself of all the reasons this was foolish. On those mornings, she was sharp-tongued and distant, and Elias, without fail, simply gave her the space she needed and remained exactly where he was. Not wounded, not punishing, just present. That, more than anything, was what finally reached her. Not grand gestures, not declarations, just the daily, undramatic fact of a man who stayed. He asked her in March, not on a special occasion, and not in any setting designed for the purpose. They were in the garden in the thin early spring sunlight, Violet on her knees, turning the first soil of the season. Elias crouched beside her, doing nothing in particular, just keeping her company the way he had taken to doing on weekend mornings. He said, "I've been thinking." "That's generally a warning," she said without looking up. She heard the quiet sound that was his almost smile. Then he said, "I'd like to stay past spring, past summer, past all of it." A pause. "Permanently." Violet stopped turning the soil. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, open expression, neither hopeful nor braced for disappointment, simply honest, simply present, simply Elias. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I am," he said. If you're willing to hear it." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come out of a storm and never made her feel crowded, never pushed, never asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. This man who had held her mother's flower book like it mattered. "I'm willing," she said quietly. They married in June, on a clear morning with the mountains visible from every angle, and Ruth Calloway crying loudly enough that the birds startled from the fence posts. It was a small ceremony. "Practical," Violet said firmly, when Ruth tried to make it larger. But she wore her grandmother's ivory dress that she had always claimed she would never wear, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers because Elias had risen early that morning and picked them from the edge of the meadow and left them on the kitchen table without a word. She looked at those flowers for a long moment before she picked them up. Then she smiled, quietly, fully, the way she did everything now, and went to marry the man who had never once asked her to trust him, who had simply made himself trustworthy, day by day, and let her find her own way there. A year later, on a morning so like that first October morning that Violet noticed it and said nothing about it to anyone, she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Elias in the yard below. He was teaching their daughter, 8 months old and thoroughly unimpressed by the lesson, to look at the mountains. He held her against his chest, one large, steady hand across her small back, and pointed at the peaks with the other, saying something Violet couldn't hear through the glass. The baby reached up and grabbed his finger instead. Elias laughed, low and warm and entirely unguarded. Violet stood at the window a moment longer, her coffee warm in both hands, the morning light clean and bright across the yard. The silence inside the cabin was not pressing against her chest. It had not pressed against her chest in a very long time. She set her cup down, put on her coat, and went outside to join them.